The sun had barely risen over the quiet town of Willow Creek, South Carolina, when I first set foot on its main street. My name's Danny, 54 years old, a cop with years of experience under my belt. I wasn't here to make friends. I was here to take charge, the new chief of police. But the town had its own way of welcoming outsiders. I walked into a small, dimly lit café, the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. The second I stepped inside, I felt it. The stares, the silent judgment. Two cops in the corner, laughing, whispering, made it clear I wasn't welcome. Their smug grins told me they'd already decided what kind of man I was. An outsider, a nobody. I played it cool, grabbed my coffee, and turned to leave. But then, "Hey, old man, you lost? 'Cause you sure don't look local?" I glanced over. One of them, tall, blonde, too sure of himself, leaned back in his chair, smirking. His partner chuckled. I shrugged, keeping my voice even. "Just passing through." They weren't buying it, and something in their eyes told me this wasn't the last time we'd meet. The next morning, I decided to go for a run just outside town. The air was crisp, the roads empty. It was the kind of peace I hadn't had in a long time. But peace doesn't last when trouble's looking for you. I heard the low hum of an engine creeping up behind me. A patrol car. I didn't even need to turn around to know who it was. Jake and Mike. Jake, the tall, wiry one with the perpetual smirk, leaned out the window. "Hey, runner, you lost?" His voice was full of fake concern, the kind that made my skin crawl. His partner, Mike, was built like a linebacker and twice as smug. "Yeah, you sure you're welcome around here?" I slowed my pace but kept my expression neutral. "Just going for a run. Pretty sure that's not illegal." Jake whistled low. "Depends on who's running." Before I could say another word, they were out of the car. Jake stepped too close, invading my space, while Mike circled behind. Then, without warning, Jake patted me down like I was some kind of criminal. I took a slow breath, keeping my temper in check. "Got anything interesting in your pockets, old man?" Jake sneered. His hand dipped into my jacket, and suddenly he held up a random piece of plastic. Something he'd planted, no doubt. "Well, well," he chuckled, waving it in the air. "Looks like we got ourselves a troublemaker." Mike grinned. "Guess we ought to take him in, huh?" Before I knew it, they each grabbed an arm and started dragging me toward town. No explanation, no questions. Just raw humiliation, plain and simple. By the time we reached the town square, people had already started gathering, and that's when it happened. Jake and Mike, still full of themselves, pushed me up against the old lamppost right in the center of town. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake announced, his voice thick with mockery, "we got ourselves a real big city troublemaker here." Mike played along, patting my pockets with exaggerated gestures. "Think he's hiding something? Or maybe he's just lost?" The crowd chuckled, some pulling out their phones, others just shaking their heads like this was normal, like they'd seen this happen before. I didn't fight. I didn't shout. I let them dig their own grave. Because what they didn't know, what they never even considered, was that the man they had just humiliated in front of the entire town was about to be their new boss. And their little performance, it was about to go viral. By the next morning, the damage had already been done, just not to me. Footage of me tied to that lamppost had spread like wildfire. Social media was ablaze with outrage. Some thought I was just a drifter who had crossed the wrong people. Others were calling out the cops directly, questioning why they were treating a stranger like some kind of street performer in an old Western town. It didn't take long before the local news picked up the story. Reporters were sniffing around, pushing microphones into people's faces, asking what crime I had committed. Most shrugged. "Beats me," one man muttered. Cops were just having fun, I guess. Jake and Mike, meanwhile, were still basking in their moment of twisted glory. They strutted around the station like local celebrities, laughing about their prank, completely oblivious to the storm brewing outside. That's when my phone rang. The number flashing on the screen, the main office. I already knew what this call was about. Word had traveled fast, straight up the chain of command. What started as a small-town joke had turned into a full-blown scandal, and my bosses weren't happy. I took a deep breath, buttoned up my uniform, and stepped into the station. The place was buzzing with morning activity. Officers grabbing coffee, chatting about last night's shift. Business as usual. But the second I walked in, the mood shifted. Some of them recognized me. Others just saw the crisp uniform, the polished badge. Whispers spread like wildfire. And then, just as I expected, Jake and Mike strolled in, laughing about something, completely unaware of what was about to happen. The moment their eyes landed on me, they froze. The blood drained from their faces. Mike looked like he'd seen a ghost. Jake, for the first time since I'd met him, didn't have a smirk on his face. I let the silence stretch. I wanted them to squirm. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm but firm. "We've got ourselves a situation, gentlemen." The room went dead quiet. Jake swallowed hard. Chief?" I nodded. "That's right. Chief Danny. The same nobody you decided to put on display yesterday." The tension in the room was suffocating. Officers were exchanging nervous glances, realizing just how badly these two had screwed up. Then, without breaking eye contact, I pulled out my phone and hit play. The video of their little stunt, every taunt, every smirk, every second of my public humiliation, echoed through the room. "In case anyone's confused," I said, turning the screen so everyone could see. "This is what happened yesterday. These two thought it would be fun to tie up a stranger in the middle of town, without even bothering to check who I was." The room stayed silent. Jake and Mike had no more jokes left. They had just become the stars of their own nightmare. The silence in the station was thick, almost suffocating. Jake and Mike stood frozen, their faces pale as the weight of their mistake sank in. Just yesterday, they had strutted around like kings of this town. Now they looked like deer caught in headlights. I let the moment stretch, watching as their confidence crumbled. Finally, Jake found his voice. He forced a chuckle, but it came out weak. "Look, Chief, this was just a misunderstanding. A little fun, that's all." I raised an eyebrow. "Fun." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, tradition. A way to keep things in line?" "A tradition." I took a slow step forward. "So you're telling me that humiliating strangers, tying them up in public, is just something you do around here?" Mike, still trying to salvage what little dignity he had left, crossed his arms. "It's harmless," he muttered. "No one gets hurt." I pulled out my phone again, scrolling through the comments under the viral video. I read one aloud. "This is disgusting. That man could have been my father, my brother, my son." The room was silent. I glanced up. "Still think no one gets hurt?" Neither of them spoke. I turned to the rest of the officers. "How many of you knew about this?" My eyes scanned the room. Some looked away. A few shifted uncomfortably. That told me everything I needed to know. "This isn't just about Jake and Mike," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "It's about a culture that let them believe this was okay." I stepped closer to them, lowering my voice so only they could hear. You didn't just humiliate a stranger, I said. You humiliated your chief, and worse, you humiliated this entire department. Jake clenched his jaw. We didn't know, he muttered. I nodded. Exactly. Because that was the whole point. They had assumed I was nobody. Someone they could push around, laugh at, make an example of. They hadn't even bothered to check who I was. That was their first mistake. Their second? Thinking there wouldn't be consequences. I turned back to the rest of the officers. Things changed today, I said. This department will not be a place where abuse of power gets brushed off as tradition. I reached into my pocket and pulled out 2 termination forms. Jake and Mike's eyes widened. Wait, Jake started, his voice panicked. I shook my head. Hand over your badges. The entire room watched as I signed both forms and placed them on the desk. For the first time since I arrived in this town, Jake and Mike looked truly powerless, because now they weren't the ones in control anymore. The badges hit the desk with a soft clink, but the sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Jake and Mike stood there, stiff as statues, their faces shifting between disbelief and panic. Just yesterday, they had strutted around like untouchable kings. Now they were nothing more than 2 disgraced officers with no future in this department. I looked around the room, letting the moment sink in. The rest of the officers, some stunned, some relieved, finally began to realize that things were changing. The old ways of doing things, over. Jake took a shaky breath. Chief, you don't have to do this. I tilted my head. Don't I? He licked his lips, searching for the right words. We were just doing what we've always done. It was never personal. That made me pause. Never personal? I took a slow step toward him, lowering my voice so only he and Mike could hear. That's the problem, I said. You never stopped to think about the people on the other side of your fun. You never thought about how they felt, how it affected their lives. Because to you, they weren't people, just nobodies. Mike swallowed hard. For the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Maybe regret, maybe fear. Jake, though? He still didn't get it. This is how things have always been, he muttered, shaking his head. You can't just come in and change everything. I straightened up, my voice loud enough for everyone to hear. That's exactly what I'm here to do. The department had been running on intimidation and unchecked power for far too long. That ended today. I turned to the rest of the team. From this point forward, this station will be run with integrity. We serve this town, not rule it. Anyone who thinks otherwise? There's the door. Silence. Then, one of the younger officers, someone who had been quiet this whole time, took a small step forward. With all due respect, Chief, he said hesitantly, does that mean things are really going to change? I met his gaze. Yes. Another officer, an older one who had likely seen and ignored years of misconduct, shifted on his feet. And if we have things to report? I nodded. My door's open, but let me be clear. If I find out that anyone is continuing these so-called traditions, there won't be warnings. There won't be second chances. I turned back to Jake and Mike. This department isn't your playground anymore. Jake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Mike let out a slow breath, looking around as if realizing, for the first time, that there was no way out of this. Finally, without another word, they turned and walked out of the station. And just like that, the real work began. As the station doors swung shut behind Jake and Mike, a heavy silence settled over the room. For the first time since I arrived in this town, I could see something shift in the eyes of the other officers. Some were shocked, others relieved. But more importantly, there was an unspoken realization hanging in the air. Things were changing, and there was no going back. I took a deep breath, then addressed the room. "This department has a choice," I said, my voice steady but firm. "We can keep running things the old way, where power is abused and respect is demanded instead of earned. Or we can start fresh. We can do this job the right way." The officers exchanged glances. Some looked uncertain. Change wasn't easy, especially when corruption had been tolerated for so long. Then, one of the senior officers, a grizzled man named Carter, spoke up. "Chief," he said, clearing his throat, "a lot of us, we've looked the other way for years. It was easier than rocking the boat. But maybe it's time we stopped." A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded in agreement. Others just stared at the floor. I met Carter's gaze. "That's exactly why I'm here." The department had been built on fear. Fear of stepping out of line. Fear of questioning authority. But leadership wasn't about fear. It was about respect. And that respect had to be earned, not forced. I walked toward the bulletin board at the front of the room and pulled down an old, faded list of unofficial rules that had been hanging there for who knows how long. Rules that encouraged covering for each other, keeping quiet, and maintaining traditions. I held it up. This is done," I said. Then, without hesitation, I ripped the paper in half and tossed it in the trash. A few officers stiffened, but others, especially the younger ones, looked almost relieved. "You want to be part of this team?" I continued. "Then you do your job with integrity. No more looking the other way. No more protecting bad cops. We serve the people of this town, not ourselves." Carter nodded slowly. "Guess we've got work to do then." I gave him a small nod of approval. "Yes, we do." Some officers still looked hesitant. That was fine. Change didn't happen overnight. But the seed had been planted. And as I looked around the room, I knew that this was the beginning of something better. This town wasn't going to be ruled by fear anymore. It was going to be protected. The first step to change had been taken, but I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Jake and Mike were gone, but their influence had lingered in this town for years. People still feared the badge. They still doubted that real justice could exist here. That was the next battle. I spent the following weeks walking the streets, talking to the locals, not as their chief, but as their neighbor. I went back to that same café where this all started, not to make a scene, but to show them that things were different now. And at first, they didn't trust me. The owner, an old man with sharp eyes, just folded his arms and grunted when I walked in. The same people who had watched me get humiliated at that lamppost avoided my gaze. But I didn't waver. Day by day, I kept showing up, kept listening, kept proving, not with words, but with actions, that this wasn't just another empty promise. And then slowly, things started to shift. The same old man who had grunted at me. One morning, he set a cup of coffee on my table without a word. A small gesture, but it meant everything. The townsfolk who had once turned a blind eye started to report things they had been too scared to speak up about before. People who had stayed silent for years finally found their voices. And my officers? They were learning too. Some resisted, sure. But most of them, they wanted to be better. They just needed the right kind of leadership. It wasn't about tearing down everything that existed. It was about rebuilding something stronger, The final test came one evening when I was locking up the station. A young boy, maybe 15, stood outside, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Chief? He said hesitantly. I nodded. What's on your mind, son? He swallowed hard. Just wanted to say, what you did? Firing those guys? That took guts. I studied him for a moment. It wasn't just about firing them, I said. It was about making sure no one else has to go through what they put people through. He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, guess it just feels like maybe things are going to be different now. I smiled. They will be, but not just because of me. I gestured toward the town around us. It takes all of us to hold each other accountable. The kid gave me a small, knowing smile before walking off into the night. That moment told me everything I needed to know. The town was finally ready to believe in something better, and I was ready to make sure they never had to fear their own police force again. Because justice isn't about power. It's about respect. And in this town, respect had just been restored. Power, when unchecked, leads to corruption. But justice, when upheld, restores faith. Jake and Mike operated under the belief that their authority made them untouchable. They treated outsiders like nuisances, enforcing their own version of law and order, one built on humiliation and fear. But real power isn't about control. It's about responsibility. What happened in this town was a wake-up call, not just for the police force, but for the entire community. It proved that silence enables injustice, but when people stand up, when they demand change, justice becomes inevitable. This story isn't just about two corrupt officers getting what they deserved. It's about a town realizing that accountability matters, that traditions built on fear don't deserve to survive. In the end, leadership isn't about ruling. It's about serving. And respect? That's something you earn. This isn't just a story. It's a reality in many places. Corruption and abuse of power thrive when good people stay silent. But the moment someone steps up and says, enough, things begin to change. If you ever witness injustice, whether it's at work, in your community, or anywhere else, don't assume someone else will fix it. Change starts with action. Speak up. Hold people accountable. Support those who fight for what's right. Because justice isn't automatic. It's a choice. And it's one we all have to make. If you believe in standing up for justice, hit that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen power abused like this? Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that make you think.